Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Let's get into today's episode. Esther Art Fair returns to New York City from May 12th through May 16th, 2026, continuing its rise as one of the most talked about independent contemporary art fairs operating during New York's massive Spring Art Week. Now, compared to some of the larger commercial fairs dominating headlines every May, Esther Art Fair occupies a very different kind of space within the contemporary art world. And honestly, that's exactly why so many artists, curators, collectors, and younger galleries have become increasingly interested in it. Esther has quickly developed a reputation for being experimental, community-driven, artist-focused, and intentionally resistant to the hyper-corporate atmosphere often associated with larger international art fairs. The fair was founded around the idea of creating a more intimate and collaborative environment where emerging galleries, artist-run spaces, and younger contemporary practices could exist outside the pressures of traditional blue-chip fair structures. EstherArtFair.com. And over the last several editions, Esther has become one of the key alternative destinations during New York Art Week. For the 2026 edition, Esther Art Fair brings together approximately 45 galleries, project spaces, and artist initiatives from New York and around the world. EstherArtFair.com. Participating exhibitors include younger galleries from cities like New York, Los Angeles, Mexico City, London, Berlin, Brussels, Seoul, Toronto, and São Paulo, creating a very international but still highly curated atmosphere. And unlike mega fairs where booths can sometimes feel repetitive or overly commercial, Esther strongly encourages focused presentations and experimental installations. That curatorial freedom changes the feeling of the fair itself. Visitors move through spaces that often feel more like temporary exhibitions rather than purely sales-driven booths. And honestly, that slower and more thoughtful atmosphere is part of what makes Esther stand out. The fair encourages discovery. People spend time with the work. Conversations happen naturally. Artists and gallerists engage directly with audiences. And because many participating galleries are younger programs, visitors often encounter artists at important turning points in their careers. Another major aspect of Esther Art Fair 2026 is the fair's emphasis on interdisciplinary and experimental practices. Painting exists beside installation, sculpture beside performance, photography beside soundworks, textile practices beside immersive digital environments. The fair embraces artists working fluidly across mediums, and that openness reflects broader shifts happening throughout contemporary culture right now. Artists increasingly move between disciplines rather than staying confined to traditional categories. Esther fully embraces that hybridity. Another exciting development this year is the expansion of Esther's site-specific installations and pop-up programming happening throughout New York City during the week. CulturedMag.com. Several participating galleries are organizing collaborative events, rooftop projects, performances, screenings, and temporary exhibitions extending beyond the primary fair itself. And during May in New York, that citywide energy becomes part of the entire experience. Frieze Week transforms the city completely. Collectors move between fairs nonstop. Gallery openings happen throughout Chelsea and the Lower East Side. Artists host dinners and performances. Museums launch major exhibitions. Fashion brands organize activations and events. And within that larger ecosystem, Esther offers something much more intimate and experimental. The fair feels younger, more flexible, more artist-centered. And honestly, that energy feels deeply connected to New York's long history of artist-run culture and independent creative communities. Another major talking point surrounding Esther Art Fair 2026 is the continued emphasis on collaboration rather than competition. The fair openly encourages participating galleries to think collectively rather than purely commercially. EstherArtFair.com. That philosophy creates a very different atmosphere compared to many traditional fairs. There's less hierarchy, less intimidation, less pressure to perform luxury. Instead, the focus remains strongly connected to experimentation, conversation, and community building. And visitors consistently mention how approachable the fair feels because of that atmosphere. Another exciting aspect this year is the strong presence of artist-run spaces and independent curatorial initiatives. Several exhibitors operate entirely outside conventional gallery systems, presenting collaborative projects, temporary collectives, publishing programs, and alternative exhibition models. ArtReview.com. That inclusion feels incredibly important because some of the most innovative work happening today often emerges outside traditional institutional structures. Esther recognizes that, and by giving visibility to those practices, the fair expands conversations around what contemporary art spaces can actually become. Another major highlight of the 2026 edition is the increased integration of performance and live programming throughout the fair week. Several artists are presenting durational performances, sound installations, spoken word collaborations, and audience interactive works unfolding in real time, artforum.com. That live dimension creates an atmosphere that feels constantly evolving. The fair changes throughout the day, installations shift. Performances emerge unexpectedly. Audiences become participants, and honestly, that unpredictability gives the fair a strong sense of immediacy. Another thing people consistently mention about Esther is its emotional atmosphere. There's vulnerability inside many of the presentations, there's experimentation, there's openness to failure and risk. And compared to larger fairs where presentations can sometimes feel highly polished or market calculated, Esther often feels refreshingly human. The work feels alive. Another major focus this year is inclusivity and representation. The fair continues prioritizing galleries and artists from underrepresented communities, including women artists, queer artists, artists of color, immigrant artists, and multidisciplinary practitioners whose work challenges traditional institutional narratives. EstherArtFair.com. And importantly, that inclusivity feels embedded structurally into the fair's identity rather than functioning as surface-level branding. That distinction matters. The conversations happening inside Esther often reflect broader questions surrounding access, visibility, labor, identity, and sustainability within the art world itself. And honestly, those conversations feel increasingly urgent right now. Another exciting development surrounding the 2026 edition is the fair's growing engagement with technology and digital experimentation. Several exhibitors are presenting immersive media environments, projection-based installations, AI-influenced works, interactive sound pieces, and hybrid physical-digital practices. Observer.com. But unlike highly commercial tech-focused events, the digital work here often feels deeply conceptual and artistically experimental rather than product-driven. That balance helps maintain the fair's intimate and creative identity. Another fascinating aspect of Esther Art Fair is how it positions itself within the broader New York art ecosystem. The fair does not attempt to compete directly with mega fairs like Frieze or TEFAF. Instead, it creates its own lane entirely. More collaborative, more experimental, more community-oriented, and honestly, that independence may be exactly why the fair continues growing in influence. Younger collectors increasingly want experiences that feel authentic rather than overly corporate. Artists want environments that allow risk-taking. Curators want spaces where discovery still feels possible. Esther seems very aware of those desires. Another important element of the fair is affordability and accessibility. Many participating galleries present works at more approachable price points compared to larger international fairs, helping younger collectors engage directly with contemporary art collecting. EstherArtFair.com. That accessibility changes the energy significantly. Students attend. Emerging collectors attend. Local artists attend. The audience feels broad and diverse. And because of that openness, the fair develops a strong sense of community throughout the week. Another thing that makes Esther particularly interesting is its refusal to fully separate art from broader cultural life. Music, design, fashion, architecture, publishing, film, and performance all intersect naturally within the fair environment. And honestly, that interdisciplinary energy feels incredibly contemporary. The boundaries between creative disciplines continue dissolving. Esther embraces that fluidity rather than resisting it. Esther Art Fair 2026 runs from May 12th through May 16th in New York City during one of the busiest and most internationally connected weeks in the contemporary art world. EstherArtFair.com. And for anyone interested in emerging galleries, artist-run culture, experimental contemporary practices, and one of the most intimate and forward-thinking fairs in New York, Esther Art Fair continues to offer an experience that feels deeply connected to the future of independent contemporary art. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Let's get into today's episode. Clio Art Fair returns to New York City for 2 consecutive editions this spring, running May 7th through May 10th, and again May 14th through May 17th, 2026, continuing its mission as one of the most artist-focused and independent alternative fairs in New York. Now, compared to some of the larger commercial fairs happening during Frieze Week, Clio Art Fair has always operated with a very different philosophy. And honestly, that difference is exactly what has made the fair stand out over the years. Clio was founded specifically to support independent artists and galleries that may not fit comfortably within the traditional blue-chip art market system. The fair openly describes itself as an anti-fair fair. And what that means is that Clio intentionally prioritizes artists over market hierarchy, experimentation over prestige, and direct engagement over exclusivity. ClioArtFair.com. That identity shapes everything about the atmosphere of the fair itself. Unlike many large international fairs, dominated by mega galleries and multi-million-dollar presentations, Clio focuses heavily on independent voices, self-represented artists, emerging galleries, and creators working outside conventional market structures. And because of that, the experience feels very personal. Visitors often speak directly with the artists themselves. Conversations become longer and more intimate. There's less distance between creator and audience. And honestly, that level of accessibility is increasingly rare within the contemporary art world. For the 2026 editions, Clio Art Fair features approximately 100 artists and exhibitors across the two May editions combined, presenting painting, sculpture, photography, installation, mixed media, performance, digital works, textile-based practices, and experimental interdisciplinary projects. ClioArtFair.com. The fair once again takes place in Chelsea, positioning itself directly inside one of the most active gallery districts in New York City during one of the busiest periods of the international art calendar. And because the fair overlaps with Frieze Week and multiple other fairs happening simultaneously across Manhattan, the city itself becomes part of the larger experience. Collectors move between fairs all day. Gallery openings happen nonstop. Artists host dinners and performances. Curators schedule studio visits across multiple neighborhoods. Museums launch major exhibitions around the same time. And within that massive ecosystem, Clio offers something more intimate and artist-driven. Another major aspect of Clio Art Fair 2026 is the continued emphasis on independent practice and curatorial freedom. Many participating artists are not represented by major galleries at all. That openness creates space for artists working outside commercial expectations, allowing for a much broader range of perspectives and aesthetics to coexist within the fair. And honestly, that diversity is one of Clio's biggest strengths. You encounter highly polished contemporary painting beside raw conceptual installations, traditional media beside experimental digital works, large-scale sculpture beside deeply personal narrative projects. The fair embraces unpredictability. And because many participants are independent artists rather than large gallery programs, the presentations often feel deeply personal and emotionally direct. Another exciting element this year is the expansion of Clio's performance and live programming. The 2026 edition includes artist talks, live performances, music collaborations, immersive projects, and interactive installations happening throughout both weekends. ClioArtFair.com. And honestly, those live elements help create a very different atmosphere compared to more static fairs. The space feels constantly evolving. A performance may suddenly begin, an artist may alter an installation in real time. Visitors may become participants inside the work itself. That fluidity gives the fair a sense of immediacy and experimentation. Another major focus this year is Clio's ongoing support for artists from underrepresented communities. The fair continues prioritizing participation from women artists, LGBTQ+ artists, immigrant artists, artists of color, disabled artists, and multidisciplinary creators whose work challenges traditional market categories. ClioArtFair.com. And that commitment reflects broader changes happening across the contemporary art world right now. Collectors and institutions are increasingly interested in expanding whose stories and perspectives are centered within cultural spaces. Clio directly contributes to that shift. But importantly, the fair does not frame diversity as a trend or marketing strategy. Instead, inclusivity feels structurally embedded into the fair's identity itself. Another thing that separates Clio from many traditional fairs is its strong connection to experimentation and emerging talent. Many visitors attend specifically to discover artists before they become more widely recognized. And historically, several artists first introduced through Clio have gone on to secure gallery representation, museum exhibitions, residency opportunities, and broader institutional visibility. That discovery aspect remains central to the fair's appeal. Another exciting development surrounding Clio Art Fair 2026 is the expansion of partnerships with local creative organizations, nonprofits, and independent curators throughout New York City. ClioArtFair.com. Several collaborative pop-ups and satellite projects are taking place throughout Chelsea and neighboring districts during the week, extending the fair beyond the primary exhibition space itself. And honestly, that decentralized energy feels very connected to New York's artistic history. For decades, many of the city's most important creative movements developed through artist-run spaces, temporary exhibitions, warehouse projects, and collaborative communities operating outside traditional institutional systems. Clio continues carrying that spirit forward. Another important aspect of the fair is affordability and accessibility. Unlike many fairs where artworks are presented almost exclusively for elite collectors, Clio often includes works across a much wider range of price points, making contemporary art collecting feel more approachable for younger audiences and first-time buyers. That accessibility changes the atmosphere significantly. People feel more comfortable asking questions. Younger collectors engage directly with artists. Students attend without feeling intimidated, and because of that openness, the fair often attracts a very diverse audience. Artists, collectors, curators, students, writers, designers, musicians, local New Yorkers, international visitors, all interacting within the same space. Another major talking point this year is the fair's increasing embrace of interdisciplinary and technology-based practices. Several exhibitors are presenting immersive media works, projection-based installations, AI-influenced projects, sound environments, and interactive digital art, artreview.com. But unlike highly commercial tech-focused events, the technology here often feels experimental, handmade, or deeply personal rather than polished corporate spectacle. That distinction helps maintain the fair's artist-centered identity. Another thing people consistently mention about Clio is the emotional atmosphere of the fair itself. There's vulnerability inside the work. There's directness, there's risk-taking, and honestly, that emotional honesty can feel refreshing during major art fair weeks where commercial pressure sometimes dominates the experience. At Clio, the emphasis remains strongly connected to artistic expression itself. That doesn't mean sales aren't important. Of course they are. Artists need support. Independent practices need sustainability. Exposure matters, but the fair still feels grounded in creativity first, rather than market branding. Another exciting aspect of the 2026 edition is the increased number of international participants. Artists and galleries are arriving from Europe, Latin America, Asia, Canada, and across the United States, bringing a wide range of perspectives and artistic languages into conversation together. ClioArtFair.com. That international presence reflects how interconnected the contemporary art world has become. And yet, despite that global scope, Clio still maintains a very human scale. The fair feels approachable, conversations feel real, people take time with the work. And honestly, that intimacy may be one of the fair's greatest strengths. Another fascinating aspect of Clio is its resistance to rigid categories. The fair embraces artists working between disciplines, outside market trends, or beyond conventional expectations. Painting merges with installation. Performance intersects with sculpture. Photography blends into sound and video. The boundaries remain fluid, and that openness allows visitors to experience contemporary art as something alive and evolving, rather than fixed. Clio Art Fair 2026 runs in 2 editions this May, from May 7th through May 10th, and again from May 14th through May 17th in New York City during one of the busiest periods of the international art calendar, ClioArtFair.com. And for anyone interested in independent artists, experimental practices, emerging voices, and one of the most artist-centered fairs in New York, Clio Art Fair continues to offer an experience that feels personal, accessible, and deeply connected to the creative spirit of the city itself. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Let's get into today's episode. Frieze Art Fair returns to New York City from May 13th through May 17th, 2026, bringing its signature mix of experimental art, independent spirit, performance, activism, and downtown energy back into the middle of one of the busiest weeks in the international art world. Now, compared to some of the massive commercial fairs happening simultaneously across New York during Frieze Week, Frieze Art Fair exists in an entirely different universe. And honestly, that's exactly the point. Frieze has always embraced being alternative, playful, artist-centered, and intentionally unconventional. The fair was founded by artist and curator Eric Ginsberg together with artist and producer Maria Van Kampen, and from the beginning, Frieze positioned itself almost as a reaction against the exclusivity and corporate atmosphere that can sometimes dominate larger art fairs. FrizeArtFair.com. Even the name itself, Frieze, carries humor and attitude. It feels casual, unexpected, a little rebellious, and that tone reflects the identity of the fair overall. Frieze Art Fair is known for supporting independent artists, emerging galleries, experimental projects, performance works, social practice, and artists who may not always fit comfortably within traditional commercial art fair structures. And over the years, the fair has developed a loyal following specifically because of that openness. For the 2026 edition, Frieze Art Fair features approximately 40 to 50 participating artists, collectives, galleries, and artist-run projects spread across multiple activations and installations throughout New York City. FrizeArtFair.com. Unlike traditional booth-driven fairs, Frieze often feels more fluid and collaborative. The fair blends exhibitions, pop-ups, performances, installations, screenings, talks, music events, and immersive projects together into one larger experience. And honestly, that flexibility is one of the reasons people love it. You never fully know what you're going to encounter. A performance might suddenly begin in the middle of the room. An artist may transform the space during the fair itself. A conversation becomes part of the artwork. Music spills into the environment. Fashion, poetry, activism, and installation all collide together. The fair embraces unpredictability. And during a week where many fairs can sometimes feel highly polished and commercially controlled, Frieze offers something raw and more spontaneous. Another major aspect of Frieze Art Fair 2026 is its strong emphasis on inclusivity and accessibility. The fair continues prioritizing participation from women artists, queer artists, artists of color, disabled artists, immigrant artists, and multidisciplinary creators working outside mainstream commercial systems. FrizeArtFair.com. That mission has been central to the fair's identity for years. Frieze openly positions itself as a platform for voices that are often underrepresented within larger institutional and market-driven spaces. And that commitment creates a very different atmosphere inside the fair. People engage directly with artists. Conversations feel personal. There's less hierarchy, less intimidation. The energy feels more connected to grassroots creative culture than luxury branding. Another exciting development this year is the expansion of Frize's performance programming and interdisciplinary collaborations. The 2026 edition includes live performances, spoken word events, sound installations, experimental film screenings, and collaborative activations involving artists, musicians, dancers, and fashion designers. CulturedMag.com. And honestly, that interdisciplinary spirit feels very aligned with where contemporary culture is heading right now. The boundaries between art forms continue dissolving. Artists move fluidly between mediums. Performance intersects with sculpture. Fashion becomes installation. Music becomes part of exhibition making. Frieze embraces all of that fluidity. Another thing that separates Frieze from many other fairs is its strong connection to activism and social engagement. Many projects presented at the fair directly address issues including identity, migration, politics, mental health, climate change, gender equity, housing, and urban transformation. Artforum.com. But importantly, the fair approaches those conversations through creativity, humor, experimentation, and community building rather than institutional distance. That immediacy makes the experience feel incredibly alive. Another major highlight this year is the fair's continued partnership with independent nonprofits, local artist organizations, and alternative creative spaces throughout New York City. FrizeArtFair.com. Several collaborative pop-ups and satellite projects are happening across Manhattan and Brooklyn during the week, extending the fair beyond a single physical venue. That decentralized structure feels important because Frieze has always embraced the idea of the city itself becoming part of the exhibition. And during Frieze Week, New York transforms completely. Collectors move between fairs all day. Gallery openings happen nonstop. Artists organize dinners, performances, and rooftop parties. Museums launch major exhibitions. Fashion brands host activations. Curators schedule studio visits across multiple boroughs. The city becomes saturated with art. And within that larger ecosystem, Frieze occupies a unique position. It feels scrappier, more experimental, more democratic. And honestly, that energy is deeply connected to New York's artistic history itself. For decades, New York's most important artistic movements often emerged outside established systems. Artists transformed warehouses into galleries, performances happened in alternative spaces, downtown culture developed through improvisation and collaboration rather than institutional approval. Frieze continues carrying that spirit forward. Another exciting aspect of the 2026 edition is the fair's growing use of immersive and interactive installations. Several participating artists are presenting projects that invite direct audience participation, blurring the line between viewer and artwork. Artreview.com. Visitors may walk through installations, contribute to evolving works, engage with performers, or become part of the artwork itself. That participatory energy creates a very different relationship between audience and exhibition. The experience becomes collective rather than passive. And honestly, that openness makes the fair feel incredibly accessible, especially for younger audiences or people who may feel intimidated by more traditional art spaces. Another major talking point surrounding Frieze Art Fair 2026 is the continued integration of technology and digital experimentation. Several artists this year are presenting AI-influenced works, immersive media environments, projection-based installations, and interactive digital projects, Observer.com. But unlike highly corporate tech-focused events, the technology here often feels handmade, playful, critical, or intentionally imperfect. That balance keeps the work feeling connected to artists rather than product design. Another thing people consistently mention about Frieze is the atmosphere itself. There's humor. There's music, there's conversation, there's spontaneity. Visitors often describe the fair as one of the most human experiences during New York Art Week. And honestly, that matters. Because during large art fair weeks, the art world can sometimes become extremely transactional. People rush from booth to booth. Conversations become brief. Everything moves fast. Frieze slows things down differently. It encourages interaction, experimentation, risk-taking, community, and because of that, many artists and visitors feel genuinely comfortable inside the space. Another exciting element this year is the fair's continued support for artist-run spaces and DIY initiatives. Several participating exhibitors operate outside conventional gallery systems entirely, presenting collaborative projects, temporary collectives, publishing initiatives, and community-based practices. FrizeArtFair.com. That inclusion feels important because some of the most innovative contemporary art today is happening outside traditional commercial structures. Frieze recognizes that, and by giving space to those practices, the fair expands the conversation around what an art fair can actually be. Not just a marketplace, but a cultural platform, a meeting point, a social environment, an experimental laboratory. Another thing that makes Frieze Art Fair stand out is its embrace of humor and playfulness. Many projects throughout the fair intentionally challenge the seriousness and exclusivity often associated with the contemporary art market. There's irony, satire, absurdity, improvisation. And honestly, that humor feels refreshing. Art doesn't always need to feel distant or intimidating. Sometimes it can also feel joyful, chaotic, emotional, weird, or deeply personal. Frieze leaves room for all of that. Frieze Art Fair 2026 runs from May 13th through May 17th across multiple locations and pop-up activations throughout New York City during one of the busiest weeks of the International Art Calendar, FrizeArtFair.com. And for anyone interested in experimental art, artist-driven culture, performance, activism, community, and one of the most unconventional experiences of New York Art Week, Frieze Art Fair continues to offer something entirely its own. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Let's get into today's episode. TEFAF New York returns to the historic Park Avenue Armory from May 15th through May 19th, 2026, bringing together some of the world's most prestigious galleries, collectors, curators, museums, and cultural institutions for what continues to be one of the most sophisticated and influential art fairs in the international art market. Now, when people talk about TEFAF, they're talking about a fair that occupies a very different category compared to many other contemporary art fairs happening throughout New York. TEFAF stands for the European Fine Art Foundation, and the organization originally began in Maastricht in the Netherlands, where its flagship fair has become legendary for museum-quality presentations spanning centuries of art history. And unlike fairs focused exclusively on contemporary art, TEFAF moves across time itself. At TEFAF, you can walk from a booth presenting a Renaissance painting into a gallery specializing in contemporary sculpture, then into rooms filled with rare antiquities, jewelry, photography, manuscripts, modern design, Asian art, old masters, and 20th century masterpieces. That breadth is one of the things that makes TEFAF so unique. It's less about trends and more about art history as a living continuum. and the New York edition has become an essential extension of that identity. For 2026, TEFAF New York features approximately 90 exhibitors from around the world, representing galleries from Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and North America. TEFAF.com. The fair once again takes place inside the iconic Park Avenue Armory on Manhattan's Upper East Side, one of the most architecturally dramatic venues in New York City. And honestly, the venue itself changes the entire atmosphere of the fair. The Armory's historic interiors, soaring ceilings, period rooms, and monumental architecture create an experience that feels almost museum-like. Unlike convention center-style fairs, TEFAF New York feels intimate, elegant, and immersive. Each gallery presentation is carefully staged almost like a temporary exhibition. Lighting matters. Furniture matters. Architecture matters. Every detail contributes to the atmosphere. And because the fair spans multiple centuries of artistic production, walking through TEFAF feels less like navigating a commercial fair and more like traveling through different moments in art history simultaneously. One of the major highlights this year is the continued expansion of contemporary art presentations within the fair. While TEFAF has historically been associated strongly with old masters and historical works, the New York edition increasingly embraces dialogues between historical and contemporary practices. ApolloMagazine.com. Several galleries this year are presenting contemporary artists alongside historical material, creating conversations across generations, cultures, and mediums. And honestly, that curatorial approach feels incredibly relevant right now. The art world today is increasingly interested in connections between past and present rather than rigid categories separating them. At TEFAF, those boundaries dissolve. A contemporary sculpture might appear beside a 17th century painting, modern design beside classical antiquities, photography beside ancient objects. The fair encourages viewers to think about continuity, influence, memory, and material history across time. Another major talking point this year is the exceptional level of museum-quality works being brought to New York. TEFAF has built its reputation around rigorous vetting standards, with committees of scholars, conservators, and specialists examining works before they appear at the fair. TEFAF.com. That vetting process has become one of the defining aspects of the fair itself. Collectors and institutions trust TEFAF because of its emphasis on scholarship, authenticity, and historical importance. And because of that reputation, major museums frequently acquire works directly from the fair. Curators from institutions across the world attend TEFAF New York each year, searching for acquisitions, loans, and research opportunities. Another exciting aspect of the 2026 edition is the continued presence of younger galleries entering the fair alongside long-established dealers. While TEFAF is often associated with highly established galleries, organizers have increasingly introduced newer exhibitors presenting contemporary and interdisciplinary practices. TheArtNewspaper.com. That balance between historical expertise and contemporary experimentation gives the fair a much more dynamic energy. And unlike fairs dominated purely by speculation or trend cycles, TEFAF often feels grounded in long-term cultural value. The conversations happening here are not only about market momentum. They're also about preservation, scholarship, and historical significance. Another major focus this year is TEFAF's cultural partnerships and museum collaborations. The fair continues working closely with major institutions throughout New York City, including partnerships involving museum programming, collector events, and educational initiatives, TEFAF.com. And during TEFAF Week, many museums coordinate important exhibitions and events around the fair's presence in the city. Collectors move between the Armory, museum galas, private collection visits, gallery dinners, and institutional openings throughout Manhattan. The atmosphere feels extremely international. You have museum directors from Europe speaking with collectors from the Middle East, curators from Asia meeting dealers from New York, advisors, historians, artists, conservators, and patrons all moving through the same rooms. And because the fair attracts such a high-level audience, many important acquisitions and relationships begin quietly inside these conversations. Another exciting development surrounding TEFAF New York 2026 is the increased emphasis on design and collectible objects. Several exhibitors this year are presenting museum-caliber furniture, decorative arts, jewelry, ceramics, and 20th century design pieces that blur the line between fine art and functional object. ArchitecturalDigest.com. That crossover between art, design, architecture, and interiors continues becoming more prominent throughout the contemporary collecting world. Collectors today increasingly build collections that move fluidly between categories. Paintings coexist with furniture, sculpture with lighting, historical objects with contemporary installations. And TEFAF reflects that interdisciplinary approach beautifully. Another fascinating aspect of TEFAF is the atmosphere of patience inside the fair itself. Unlike some contemporary fairs where people rush quickly through booths trying to see everything, TEFAF encourages slower looking. Visitors spend time with objects. They study details. They ask questions. They engage deeply with materials and histories. And honestly, that slower rhythm feels refreshing. The fair reminds audiences that art can also be about contemplation rather than constant spectacle. Another major point of excitement this year involves several special installations and curated presentations happening throughout the armory itself. TEFAF.com. These projects include site-specific installations, historical displays, and curated thematic presentations connecting different galleries and historical periods together. And because the armory itself is such a visually dramatic building, these installations become part of the architecture in a very cinematic way. The relationship between space and object becomes incredibly important throughout the fair. There's also a noticeable increase this year in conversations surrounding sustainability, conservation, and the future of collecting. Several talks and panels throughout TEFAF Week address topics including cultural preservation, ethical collecting, conservation science, and the evolving role of private collectors within institutional ecosystems. Artforum.com. And that intellectual side of the fair is one of the reasons TEFAF continues holding such influence globally. It's not only a marketplace, it's also a meeting point for scholarship, research, preservation, and cultural dialogue. Another exciting aspect of the fair is the extraordinary range of materials visitors encounter. Ancient marble sculpture, rare manuscripts, contemporary paintings, photography, jewelry, furniture, ceramics, works on paper, bronze sculptures, textiles, minimalist design, Renaissance portrait, all existing together within the same environment. That diversity creates a completely different emotional experience compared to fairs focused exclusively on contemporary work. You become aware of artistic continuity across centuries. And honestly, TEFAF can completely change the way people think about collecting. The fair encourages audiences to look beyond categories and trends and instead think about quality, craftsmanship, historical resonance, and cultural significance. There's also something deeply New York about TEFAF's Upper East Side presence. The Park Avenue Armory, Museum Mile nearby, historic townhouses, private collections, auction houses, major galleries. The neighborhood itself reinforces the fair's atmosphere of history, collecting, and cultural legacy. And during TEFAF Week, the Upper East Side becomes one of the central meeting points of the international art world. TEFAF New York 2026 runs from May 15th through May 19th at the Park Avenue Armory in New York City, TEFAF.com. And for anyone interested in museum-quality art, historical dialogue, contemporary innovation, and one of the most intellectually ambitious fairs in the world, TEFAF New York continues to stand in a category entirely of its own. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Let's get into today's episode. Future Fair returns to New York City from May 13th through May 16th, 2026, once again taking over Chelsea Industrial during one of the busiest and most internationally connected weeks in the contemporary art world. Now, compared to some of the larger global mega fairs happening during Frieze Week, Future Fair occupies a very different position within the art world ecosystem. And honestly, that difference is exactly what has made the fair so important over the last several years. Future Fair was founded with a very specific mission to create a more equitable, transparent, and sustainable art fair model for younger galleries and emerging artists. That mission feels especially relevant right now. The contemporary art world can often be incredibly expensive and difficult for smaller galleries to navigate. Booth costs continue rising, shipping costs increase. International travel becomes more competitive, and many younger galleries struggle to survive within a system dominated by massive global dealers. Future Fair emerged as a response to those realities. Founded during the pandemic era by art dealers Rachel Mijares Fick and Rebecca Laliberte, the fair was built around the idea that emerging galleries deserved better access, fairer pricing structures, and stronger community support. FutureFairs.com. And since launching, the fair has quickly become one of the most respected emerging art fairs in New York. For the 2026 edition, Future Fair features approximately 70 galleries and artist-run spaces from around the world, with a strong emphasis on first-time exhibitors, younger programs, and underrepresented voices. Futurefairs.com. And unlike many traditional fairs, where booth placement and pricing heavily favor larger galleries, Future Fair has continued using alternative financial models intended to support smaller exhibitors more fairly. That includes initiatives like reduced booth costs, collaborative programming, and profit-sharing structures designed to make participation more accessible. Artnews.com. And honestly, those structural conversations are becoming increasingly important across the art world. Because the future of contemporary art doesn't only depend on major galleries and collectors. It also depends on whether smaller galleries and emerging artists can actually survive long-term. Future Fair directly addresses that issue. This year's edition includes galleries from New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Mexico City, London, Berlin, Seoul, Toronto, São Paulo, and several other international cities. Futurefairs.com. And what's exciting about the fair is the diversity of practices being presented. Painting, sculpture, photography, installation, textile work, digital media, performance, conceptual projects, ceramics, and interdisciplinary practices all coexist throughout the fair. There's a visible openness to experimentation, and because many exhibitors are younger galleries, visitors often encounter artists who are at major turning points in their careers. That sense of discovery really defines the atmosphere of Future Fair. People attend specifically to find artists they may not yet know. Collectors often describe the fair as one of the best places during New York Art Week to discover emerging talent before artists become heavily established within the market. And over the past few editions, several artists first introduced through Future Fair have gone on to gain significant institutional attention, residency opportunities, and international gallery representation. Another major highlight this year is the expansion of the fair's partnerships and mentorship initiatives. Future Fair continues collaborating with arts nonprofits, collector groups, curators, and residency organizations to create educational programming and professional support systems for participating galleries. Futurefairs.com. That infrastructure matters, because for many emerging galleries, visibility alone is not enough. They also need access to networks, mentorship, press opportunities, and institutional relationships that can help sustain long-term growth. And Future Fair seems very aware of that reality. One of the most talked about aspects of the fair this year is the continued development of the Future Fair Prize and Curatorial Fellowship initiatives. Futurefairs.com. These programs support artists and galleries through acquisition opportunities, curator engagement, and public recognition throughout the week. And that emphasis on direct support rather than simply exposure feels especially meaningful. Exposure alone doesn't sustain artists, infrastructure does. And Future Fair repeatedly positions itself around building that infrastructure. The location itself also contributes heavily to the fair's identity. Chelsea Industrial has become one of the defining venues of New York Art Week, hosting several fairs and creative events throughout the year. The raw industrial architecture, open layouts, concrete floors, and downtown atmosphere create an environment that feels connected to New York's long history of artist studios and warehouse exhibitions. It feels energetic, young, experimental. And compared to more polished convention center style fairs, Future Fair often feels more grounded in artist culture itself. Another exciting aspect of Future Fair 2026 is the expansion of pop-up programming and off-site collaborations happening throughout Chelsea during the week. Culturedmag.com. Several participating galleries are organizing temporary exhibitions, rooftop installations, after-parties, and collaborative performances throughout Manhattan. And because Future Fair overlaps with Frieze Week, NADA, Independent, and several other fairs simultaneously, New York itself becomes completely transformed during these few days in May. Collectors move continuously between fairs. Artists attend openings across multiple neighborhoods. Curators schedule nonstop studio visits. Fashion brands host dinners and activations. Museums coordinate major exhibitions around the same time. The entire city becomes one interconnected cultural ecosystem. And within that ecosystem, Future Fair has carved out a very specific identity. It feels younger, more community-driven, more collaborative, and importantly, it feels hopeful. That optimism matters because the contemporary art world can often feel extremely exclusive and financially overwhelming, especially for younger artists and galleries trying to establish themselves. Future Fair offers an alternative model. And while yes, sales absolutely happen at the fair, the atmosphere still feels centered around dialogue, experimentation, and long-term growth rather than purely luxury branding. Another major focus this year is the fair's ongoing commitment to inclusivity and representation. Many participating galleries specifically focus on artists from historically underrepresented communities, including women artists, queer artists, artists of color, immigrant artists, and multidisciplinary practitioners working outside traditional market expectations. Artforum.com. That emphasis reflects larger shifts happening throughout the art world right now. Collectors are increasingly interested in broader perspectives and narratives. Institutions are reevaluating historical exclusions, and younger audiences are demanding more diverse representation within contemporary culture. Future Fair appears very conscious of those conversations. Another exciting element of this year's edition is the increase in interdisciplinary and technology-based work throughout the fair. Several exhibitors are presenting immersive installations, sound works, moving image projects, AI-influenced media, and experimental digital practices, artreview.com. But unlike some fairs that lean heavily into spectacle, Future Fair still maintains a strong focus on artistic experimentation and conceptual depth. Technology becomes part of the artistic language rather than simply a trend. And honestly, that balance helps the fair feel authentic. One thing that really stands out about Future Fair is the visible presence of artists themselves. At many major fairs, artists can sometimes feel disconnected from the commercial environment surrounding the work. At Future Fair, artists are often inside the booths, speaking directly with audiences, collectors, and curators throughout the week. That creates a very different energy. Visitors engage with practices more personally. Conversations become longer and more meaningful. There's less distance between the artwork and the people creating it, and because of that, the fair often feels incredibly alive. You feel possibility inside the space. You see younger galleries taking risks. You see experimental installations. You see artists testing new ideas. You see curators discovering emerging practices in real time. That sense of momentum defines the fair. And honestly, fairs like Future Fair play an important role in shaping what the future of the contemporary art world might actually look like. Not only aesthetically, but structurally. Questions around sustainability, accessibility, equity, collaboration, and artist support are becoming increasingly urgent. And Future Fair actively places those conversations at the center of its identity. That's part of what makes the fair so influential despite its relatively young history. It's not only presenting art, it's also proposing alternative ways of building the art world itself. Future Fair 2026 runs from May 13th through May 16th at Chelsea Industrial in New York City during one of the busiest weeks of the International Art Calendar, futurefairs.com. And for anyone interested in discovering emerging artists, supporting younger galleries, and experiencing one of the most forward-thinking and community-driven fairs in New York, Future Fair continues to be one of the most exciting destinations of the season. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Let's get into today's episode. 154 Contemporary African Art Fair returns to New York City from May 13th through May 17th, 2026. Once again, bringing together galleries, artists, collectors, curators, and institutions from across Africa and the global diaspora for one of the most important art fairs dedicated to contemporary African art in the world. Now, for people unfamiliar with the name, the title 154 actually carries a deeper meaning. The 1 represents one continent. The 54 represents the 54 countries that make up Africa. And from the very beginning, the fair was created to challenge the way African contemporary art has historically been represented within the global art market. Founded by Touria El Glaoui in London back in 2013, 154 quickly became far more than simply an art fair. It became a platform for visibility, dialogue, education, and cultural exchange centered around artists from Africa and the African diaspora. And over the past decade, the fair has played a major role in helping reshape global conversations around contemporary African art. Today, artists from across the continent are increasingly being included in major museum exhibitions, biennials, institutional collections, and international art fairs, and 154 has absolutely been part of that shift. The New York edition has become especially important because of the city's role as one of the central hubs of the international art world. Each year during Frieze Week, 154 brings together an incredible range of voices, perspectives, and practices inside a much more intimate and focused environment compared to some of the larger mega fairs happening simultaneously across the city. For the 2026 edition, the fair features approximately 30 galleries representing artists from more than 17 countries across Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and North America, 154com. That international mix has always been one of the defining characteristics of the fair. You have galleries based directly in cities like Lagos, Accra, Johannesburg, Marrakesh, Cairo, Nairobi, and Dakar, exhibiting alongside galleries from Paris, London, New York, Dubai, and Brussels. And that global structure reflects the reality of contemporary African art today. The artists themselves are often working across multiple geographies. Many move between continents. Some are based within Africa, while others are part of a broader diaspora network stretching across Europe and the United States. The fair embraces that complexity rather than trying to define African contemporary art as a single style or identity, and honestly, that's one of the most important things about 154. The fair consistently pushes against oversimplified narratives. There is no single African contemporary art aesthetic. Instead, visitors encounter an enormous diversity of practices, materials, histories, and perspectives. Painting, sculpture, photography, textile-based works, performance, installation, moving image, conceptual practices, and mixed media projects all coexist throughout the fair. And many of the artists represented are engaging with themes that resonate globally while remaining deeply connected to specific local histories and experiences. Another major highlight this year is the continued expansion of the fair's special projects and talks program. 1-54 has become known not only for its gallery presentations, but also for its conversations, panels, educational initiatives, and collaborations with museums and nonprofits throughout New York City. 1-54com. The 2026 edition includes artist talks, curator conversations, collector forums, and discussions surrounding issues like migration, identity, sustainability, archival practices, and the evolving role of African institutions within the global art ecosystem. And honestly, those conversations are incredibly important because contemporary African art is still too often framed through limited or outdated perspectives within mainstream Western art history. 1-54 creates space for artists and curators to define those narratives themselves. That shift matters. The fair also continues its partnerships with educational institutions and residency organizations throughout New York, helping create opportunities for artists beyond the commercial side of the fair itself. 1-54com. And that balance between market visibility and long-term cultural infrastructure is part of why 1-54 has become so respected internationally. This year's edition also includes several highly anticipated solo presentations from emerging galleries and younger artists, gaining increasing international attention. Many collectors specifically attend 1-54 to discover artists before they become more widely visible in the broader market. And historically, the fair has been incredibly influential in launching artists into museum exhibitions, biennials, and institutional collections worldwide. Several artists who previously exhibited at 1-54 have since gone on to appear in Venice Biennale exhibitions, major museum retrospectives, and prominent international collections. That track record has strengthened the fair's influence significantly over the past decade. Another exciting aspect of 1-54 New York 2026 is the fair's emphasis on interdisciplinary collaborations. Fashion, design, architecture, music, and film increasingly intersect throughout the programming. And that crossover feels very natural because many contemporary African artists already work fluidly across disciplines. Several special activations this year reportedly include collaborations between artists and designers, along with pop-up installations and site-specific projects happening throughout Manhattan during the week. Culturedmag.com. And during Frieze Week, New York itself becomes part of the experience. Collectors move between fairs all day. Gallery openings happen non-stop across Chelsea and the Lower East Side. Museums launch major exhibitions, artists host dinners and performances. Fashion brands organize activations. Curators move from studio visits to after-parties late into the night. And within that larger ecosystem, 1-54 occupies a unique position. The fair feels more intimate, more focused, more conversation-driven. Visitors often spend significant time engaging directly with galleries and learning about the artist's practices in depth. That atmosphere creates a very different experience compared to some of the larger commercial fairs where people move quickly through hundreds of booths. At 1-54, there's space for dialogue. And because of that, the fair often feels deeply personal. Another important element of this year's edition is the growing presence of galleries from North and West Africa. Over the past several years, cities like Lagos, Accra, Marrakesh, and Cairo have emerged as increasingly influential centers for contemporary art production and collecting. artnews.com. New institutions, residency programs, independent spaces, and collector networks continue developing throughout the continent, and the global art market is paying closer attention than ever before. At the same time, many artists represented at 154 continue addressing themes connected to colonial history, migration, labor, spirituality, ecology, memory, urban transformation, and identity. But importantly, the work is never reducible to those themes alone. There's also humor, abstraction, material experimentation, futurism, minimalism, performance, joy, fashion, sound, architecture. The fair presents African contemporary art as expansive and multidimensional rather than narrowly political or ethnographic. And that distinction feels incredibly important. One of the most exciting shifts happening right now is the increasing recognition of African contemporary art institutions themselves. For years, much of the global art market treated Europe and the United States as the primary centers validating artistic success. But today, institutions, biennials, museums, and collector communities throughout Africa are becoming increasingly influential in shaping international discourse directly. 154 reflects that evolution. The fair no longer simply introduces African artists to Western audiences. Instead, it operates as part of a much larger global network of institutions and conversations already happening across the continent itself. That's a huge shift. Another major talking point this year is the continued rise of younger collectors engaging with artists represented at the fair. There's growing interest from younger audiences who are actively seeking work connected to global histories, diasporic experiences, and emerging cultural movements beyond traditional Western frameworks. FinancialTimes.com. And fairs like 154 are increasingly becoming spaces where those collectors, curators, and artists connect directly. There's also a visible effort within the fair to maintain accessibility and educational engagement. Panels, walkthroughs, and programming are designed not only for experienced collectors, but also for students, younger audiences, and first-time visitors interested in learning more about contemporary African art. That openness is part of the fair's identity. And honestly, that accessibility helps create a much more welcoming atmosphere. The fair feels intellectually ambitious while still remaining approachable. And as the art world continues becoming more international, fairs like 1-54 play an increasingly important role in expanding whose stories, histories, and artistic languages are centered within global contemporary art conversations. The impact of the fair extends far beyond sales. It influences museum programming, curatorial research, academic discourse, collector awareness, institutional acquisitions, and long-term visibility for artists and galleries across the continent and diaspora. 154 Contemporary African Art Fair 2026 runs from May 13th through May 17th in New York City during one of the busiest and most internationally connected weeks in the contemporary art world, 154com. And for anyone interested in discovering artists shaping the future of global contemporary art, 1-54 continues to be one of the most essential and influential fairs in New York. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Let's get into today's episode. NYC New York returns from May 13th through May 17th, 2026. Taking over the iconic Starrett Lehigh building in Chelsea once again for what has become one of the most important platforms for emerging contemporary art in the world. Now, for people unfamiliar with NADA, the name actually stands for the New Art Dealers Alliance, and unlike many traditional art fairs, NADA operates as a non-profit organization. That distinction is important because it shapes the entire identity and atmosphere of the fair itself. NADA has always positioned itself as artist-centered, community-driven, and focused on supporting younger galleries and experimental practices, rather than simply catering to the high-end luxury market. And honestly, that's what makes NADA feel different from so many other fairs happening during New York Art Week. While larger fairs often emphasize blue-chip names, massive booths, and multi-million-dollar sales, NADA has built its reputation around discovery. This is the fair where collectors, curators, artists, and critics often come specifically to find the next generation of influential artists before the wider market catches on. And for 2026, NADA New York feels especially ambitious. This year's edition features over 120 galleries, nonprofits, and artist-run spaces from more than 19 countries, creating one of the most internationally diverse editions in the fair's history, newartdealers.org. The Starrett Lehigh building itself continues to be one of the perfect homes for the fair. The historic industrial architecture, massive windows, open floor plans, and views across Chelsea create a very New York atmosphere. The building carries this mixture of downtown history, industrial design, and creative energy that really aligns with NADA's identity. And unlike some fairs that can feel extremely formal or intimidating, NADA often feels more relaxed, conversational, and exploratory. People spend time inside the booths. Artists are often present. Gallerists actually engage in long conversations. Collectors discover work organically. There's a sense of accessibility that makes the fair especially important for younger audiences entering the contemporary art world. One of the major highlights this year is the return of the TD Bank curated spotlight section, which focuses on emerging galleries presenting ambitious solo and two artist exhibitions, newartdealers.org. This section has become one of the most anticipated areas of the fair because it allows galleries to take risks and present highly focused installations rather than trying to overcrowd booths with inventory, and that's something NADA consistently prioritizes. The fair repeatedly emphasizes curatorial experimentation over pure commercial presentation. This year's edition includes a particularly strong emphasis on artist-run initiatives and nonprofit organizations, continuing NADA's long-standing mission of supporting alternative art ecosystems. Participating spaces include independent galleries from New York, Los Angeles, Mexico City, São Paulo, Berlin, Seoul, London, Athens, Tokyo, and beyond. newartdealers.org. There's also a noticeable increase in participation from Latin American galleries this year, reflecting the growing international influence of artists and curators working throughout Central and South America. And one of the exciting things about NADA is that the fair often introduces audiences to regions and artistic communities that larger commercial fairs sometimes overlook. You walk through the fair and suddenly discover a gallery from Guatemala City presenting a young painter next to a nonprofit from Athens showing experimental installation work beside a Seoul-based gallery introducing multimedia artists. That diversity creates an entirely different viewing experience. And unlike fairs that feel dominated by a single aesthetic trend, NADA often feels unpredictable. Painting exists beside performance. Sculpture beside sound work, textiles beside conceptual installation, photography beside digital experimentation. The fair embraces that multiplicity. Another major point of excitement surrounding NADA New York 2026 is the expansion of NADA Presents, the fair's programming platform featuring conversations, performances, screenings, and live events throughout the week. newartdealers.org. This year's Talks program includes artist conversations, curator panels, collector discussions, and presentations addressing issues like sustainability, emerging art markets, artist-run culture, and the evolving relationship between technology and contemporary art. And honestly, those conversations are part of what makes NADA so valuable. The fair doesn't only function as a marketplace. It also functions as an educational and cultural platform. There's a visible effort to create dialogue around the realities of being an artist or running an emerging gallery today. That's especially important right now because the economics of the art world continue to become increasingly difficult for younger galleries. Rent costs rise, shipping costs rise, production costs rise. International travel becomes more expensive, and yet fairs like NADA continue creating opportunities for smaller galleries to gain international visibility. That role cannot be underestimated. For many participating galleries, NADA can genuinely change the trajectory of their program. A successful booth can lead to museum acquisitions, institutional exhibitions, international press coverage, collector relationships, and long-term growth. And for artists, the exposure can be career-defining. Another exciting aspect of NADA New York 2026 is the continued integration of pop-up activations throughout Chelsea and the surrounding neighborhoods. Several participating galleries are coordinating off-site exhibitions, temporary installations, rooftop events, and collaborative after-hours programming during the week. culturedmag.com. And because NADA overlaps with Frieze Week and the broader New York art calendar in May, the city itself becomes completely activated. Gallery openings happen simultaneously across Chelsea and the Lower East Side. Collectors move between fairs all day long. Artists host dinners and performances. Museums launch major exhibitions. Independent spaces organize late-night programming. There's this non-stop creative energy moving through the city, and NADA occupies a very specific position within that ecosystem. It's often considered one of the most approachable and community-oriented fairs during the week. That atmosphere matters. Younger artists attend, students attend, Emerging curators attend. People who may feel intimidated by larger fairs often feel comfortable inside NADA. And because of that openness, the fair has developed a very loyal audience over the years. Another major talking point this year is NADA's increasing emphasis on sustainability and alternative exhibition models. Several exhibitors are presenting booths designed with reusable structures, recycled materials, and lower impact shipping strategies, artforum.com. The fair itself has also continued discussions around creating more sustainable economic models for younger galleries participating in international art fairs. That conversation feels especially relevant right now because the traditional fair system has become increasingly expensive and competitive. NADA's nonprofit structure allows it to approach those conversations differently compared to many corporate fair organizations. And that mission-driven approach continues attracting galleries that value experimentation, collaboration, and artist-centered programming. Another exciting development for 2026 is the fair's growing connection to digital and interdisciplinary practices. Several exhibitors are presenting projects involving moving image, sound installation, AI-influenced media, and immersive technologies, artreview.com. But unlike some technology-focused events that prioritize spectacle, NADA's approach still feels grounded in artistic inquiry rather than trend-chasing. The technology becomes part of the conversation rather than the entire focus. And that balance helps the fair maintain its identity. One thing people consistently say about NADA is that it still feels connected to artists in a very real way. The fair originated from a network of younger dealers trying to support one another and create alternatives within the traditional art market system. Even as the fair has grown internationally, that spirit still feels present. There's collaboration between galleries, there's openness between exhibitors, there's room for experimentation and failure. And honestly, that vulnerability is part of what makes contemporary art exciting in the first place. Not every booth needs to feel perfectly polished or hyper-commercial. Sometimes the most memorable work comes from risk-taking, and NADA continues creating space for that risk. The fair also maintains strong relationships with nonprofits, residency programs, and educational initiatives, helping connect emerging artists with broader professional networks. That infrastructure matters because the contemporary art world often depends heavily on access and visibility. Fairs like NADA create moments where artists, curators, collectors, writers, and institutions all intersect inside one environment. And during those few days in May, entirely new opportunities can emerge. Careers begin, collaborations form, exhibitions get planned, collections evolve, all happening through conversations taking place inside the aisles of the fair. There's also something uniquely New York about NADA. The industrial setting, the downtown energy, the blend of emerging and established voices, the mixture of international perspectives colliding inside Chelsea during one of the busiest art weeks of the year. It reflects the city's role as a place where different creative communities continuously intersect. And even as the art world becomes increasingly globalized, New York still remains one of the central meeting points for contemporary culture. NADA New York 2026 runs from May 13th through May 17th at the Starrett Lehigh Building in Chelsea, New York City, newartdealers.org. For anyone interested in discovering emerging artists, exploring experimental gallery programs, or experiencing one of the most community-driven fairs in the international art world, NADA continues to be one of the essential destinations during New York Art Week. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Let's get into today's episode. Independent Art Fair is back in New York City for its 17th edition, running from May 14th through May 17th, 2026, and this year marks one of the biggest transformations in the fair's history. For the first time ever, Independent is taking over Pier 36 on the Lower East Side, moving away from its longtime home at Spring Studios in Tribeca and expanding into a completely reimagined waterfront venue. The move is major, not only because of the scale of the new space, but because it signals a new chapter for one of the most respected alternative art fairs in the world. Pier 36 offers more than 70,000 square feet of exhibition space overlooking the East River, and according to organizers, the expanded venue more than doubles the footprint of previous editions. And honestly, that feels very fitting for Independent. Unlike many traditional mega fairs that focus heavily on scale and spectacle, Independent has always positioned itself differently. The fair has built its reputation around discovery, experimentation, curatorial thinking, and emerging conversations within contemporary art. Independent often feels less like a conventional trade show and more like walking through a temporary curated exhibition where galleries are encouraged to take risks. That identity has made the fair incredibly increasingly influential over the years. Many artists and galleries that first gained major visibility through independent later went on to exhibit internationally, join blue-chip programs, and enter museum collections. And for 2026, the fair seems fully committed to expanding that mission. This year's edition features 76 exhibitors from around the world, with nearly half of the galleries participating in independent for the very first time. That statistic alone says a lot about the fair's philosophy. Instead of relying only on established names year after year, independent continues to introduce fresh galleries, younger programs, and new voices into the conversation. And another major detail this year is that more than a third of the presentations are solo artist booths focused on artists who have never previously had solo presentations in New York. That initiative is now officially being framed under the fair's new curatorial platform called Independent Debuts. And that's one of the reasons so many curators, collectors, and art professionals pay close attention to independent. It's often where you see the future of the art world before the wider market fully catches on. One of the biggest talking points surrounding this year's fair is the new architectural redesign of the space itself. The internationally recognized architecture firm SOIL, known formally as Solid Objectives Edinburgh Lou, has designed the exterior environment for Pier 36. While the exhibition interiors are being developed by Diogo Passarinho Studio, also known as DPS. And instead of creating a generic convention center layout, the fair is approaching the design almost like a conceptual exhibition. The architecture reportedly draws inspiration from New York's downtown art history and the city's legacy of artist-run spaces and experimental environments from the 1970s and 1980s. That historical connection feels important because independent has always embraced a more downtown, artist-centered identity compared to some of the more corporate-feeling fairs. The Lower East Side location also strategically places the fair directly next to one of the strongest gallery neighborhoods in New York. And many of those nearby Lower East Side galleries are participating for the first time this year. New exhibitors include Spencer Brownstone Gallery, Kiang Maling, David Peter Francis, Superhouse, Osmos, and Post Times. Meanwhile, returning galleries include Uffner and Liu, March, and Long Story Short, helping create a strong local New York presence throughout the fair. Another major highlight this year is the return of Jack Shainman Gallery to a New York art fair after more than 6 years away. That return alone has generated a lot of conversation across the art world because Jack Shainman is one of the most respected contemporary galleries in the country, representing artists whose work frequently enters museum collections and major institutional exhibitions. Independent 2026 is also heavily emphasizing international participation. Galleries are arriving from Europe, Asia, Latin America, and across the United States, creating a global mix of perspectives while still maintaining the fair's intimate atmosphere. And unlike some larger fairs where booths can feel overwhelming or commercially repetitive, Independent encourages galleries to build focused presentations that feel almost museum-like. There's a slower rhythm to the fair. Visitors are encouraged to spend time with the work rather than simply rushing from booth to booth. And that slower, more thoughtful environment is part of what has made Independent so respected among artists and curators. One of the most exciting crossovers this year involves fashion. Independent 2026 is hosting a special project connected to Comme des Garçons and legendary designer Rei Kawakubo. More than 20 semi-unique recent pieces by Kawakubo will reportedly be presented within a site-specific architectural installation designed by the designer herself. And this marks the first major New York presentation of this body of work since the Metropolitan Museum of Art's groundbreaking Rei Kawakubo and Comme des Garçons exhibition back in 2017. That crossover between fashion, architecture, installation, and contemporary art feels very aligned with where the art world is heading right now. The boundaries between disciplines continue to dissolve. Fashion brands increasingly collaborate with artists. Artists create installations that feel cinematic or theatrical. Design becomes part of exhibition making itself. And fairs like Independent are becoming spaces where all of those worlds intersect. There's also a strong nonprofit and community partnership element surrounding this year's edition. Independent announced a partnership with the historic Henry Street Settlement, one of New York's oldest social service and arts organizations. The organization will host a gala celebration during the opening night of the fair, with proceeds helping support Henry Street's social services, healthcare initiatives, and arts programming throughout New York City. That partnership reflects something important about Independent's identity. The fair repeatedly describes itself as a mission-driven organization rather than simply a commercial marketplace. And while yes, major collectors and institutions attend Independent every year, there's still a visible attempt to maintain a connection to artists, nonprofits, alternative culture, and community engagement. And during Independent Week, the Lower East Side itself becomes part of the experience. Visitors move between the fair, nearby gallery openings, artist dinners, rooftop events, pop-ups, after-parties, and museum exhibitions throughout downtown Manhattan. The entire neighborhood becomes activated. That energy is one of the things that makes New York during May feel so special for the art world. You have Frieze happening simultaneously across the city. You have gallery openings in Chelsea and the Lower East Side. You have nonprofit spaces launching exhibitions. You have collectors flying in from around the world. And in the middle of all of that activity, Independent offers something slightly different. It feels more experimental, more intimate, more discovery-driven. It's a fair where visitors often leave talking about artists they had never heard of before entering the building. And honestly, that's increasingly rare in today's art market. Many fairs have become extremely predictable, dominated by the same names and same presentations repeated internationally from city to city. Independent pushes against that. The fair is intentionally structured around surprise, experimentation, and new conversations. And because of that, it often feels more connected to the actual evolution of contemporary art rather than simply the commercial side of it. Of course, sales still matter. Major acquisitions happen here. Museum curators attend. Collectors buy work. Careers are launched. But there's also a visible effort to preserve curiosity inside the experience. And that balance between commerce and experimentation may be exactly why Independent has continued to grow in influence over the past 17 years. For artists especially, Independent can represent a huge moment of visibility. A successful presentation at the fair can completely shift the trajectory of an artist's career, leading to institutional interest, international exhibitions, press coverage, and long-term gallery relationships. And for audiences, it creates a rare opportunity to encounter a broad spectrum of contemporary art practices all under one roof. Painting, sculpture, installation, textiles, conceptual work, photography, moving image, performance, architecture, fashion-based projects, all of it coexisting together inside this new waterfront environment at Pier 36. There's also something poetic about the location itself. A pier along the East River, industrial architecture, downtown Manhattan, contemporary art occupying a transitional urban space. It feels connected to New York's long history of artists transforming overlooked or industrial spaces into centers of creativity. And that history becomes part of the atmosphere of the fair itself. Independent Art Fair 2026 runs from May 14th through May 17th at Pier 36 on the Lower East Side of New York City. For collectors, curators, artists, and anyone interested in where contemporary art is heading next, Independent continues to be one of the most important and most closely watched fairs in New York. Welcome to Tarik Talk. Let's get into this episode. Frieze New York is back for 2026, returning to the shed from May 13th through May 17th, and once again transforming New York City into the center of the global contemporary art world. This year marks the 15th edition of Frieze New York, and the energy around the fair feels bigger than ever. Located in Hudson Yards, the shed has become the home of Frieze New York over the last several years, and the venue itself really changes the experience of the fair. Unlike the older tent structure Frieze used on Randall's Island years ago, the shed gives the event a more architectural, urban, and integrated feeling with the city. You walk outside and immediately you're surrounded by galleries, museums, restaurants, Chelsea exhibitions, the High Line, and non-stop activity across Manhattan during Frieze Week. For anyone unfamiliar with Frieze, this is one of the most influential art fairs in the world. Alongside editions in London, Los Angeles, and Seoul, Frieze New York has become one of the key moments on the international art calendar, where collectors, curators, museum directors, artists, celebrities, and galleries all come together under one roof. And this year's edition is massive. Frieze New York 2026 features approximately 68 to 70 galleries from around 26 countries, bringing together a combination of blue-chip powerhouse galleries, mid-career programs, and younger experimental spaces. One of the major conversations around this year's fair is the strong representation of Latin American galleries and artists. Frieze has specifically highlighted its increased focus on Central and South American voices in this edition, which feels especially important considering how influential Latin American contemporary art has become globally over the last decade. You have galleries coming from Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Chile, and beyond, alongside major international exhibitors from Europe, Asia, and the United States. At the same time, many New York galleries continue to anchor the fair, creating this balance between local presence and global dialogue. Some of the major returning galleries include Gagosian, Hauser and Wirth, Pace Gallery, David Zwirner, Periton, White Cube, and Thaddeus Ropac. But what makes Frieze exciting is that it's never only about the mega galleries. One of the most anticipated sections every year is Focus, curated once again by Lumi Tan. The Focus section spotlights younger galleries that have been operating for under 12 years, often giving visitors the chance to discover artists before they become internationally established names. And that's really one of the most exciting parts of Frieze New York. You can walk from a booth presenting museum-level historical artists directly into a presentation by an emerging artist having one of the first major moments of their career. The fair creates these collisions between generations, markets, aesthetics, and geographies all happening simultaneously. This year, one of the big stories coming out of the Focus section is the Focus Stand Prize, which was awarded to Buenos Aires-based W Galleria for its presentation of indigenous Chilean artist Seba Calfuqueo. That award really reflects a larger shift happening in the art world right now. Institutions and fairs are increasingly recognizing artists and galleries working outside traditional Euro-American centers, and Frieze 2026 seems very aware of that momentum. Another thing that separates Frieze New York from many fairs is the programming outside the booths themselves. This year's Frieze Projects expands beyond the shed into collaborations with major institutions across New York City, including Whitney Museum of American Art and Dia Art Foundation. Instead of only functioning as a commercial fair, Frieze is increasingly positioning itself as a citywide cultural platform. There are performances, installations, moving image works, conversations, and immersive projects happening throughout Chelsea and Hudson Yards during the week. One of the featured performance artists this year is Kite, collaborating with Counterpublic, while other programming includes projects by David Lamelas and Jonathan Gonzalez. And honestly, that expansion beyond the booths is important because it changes the feeling of the event. Frieze Week becomes less about simply buying and selling art and more about creating an ecosystem across the city. During Frieze Week, New York itself becomes part of the experience. Museums coordinate major openings, galleries launch new exhibitions, fashion brands host dinners and activations. Collectors move from breakfast meetings to studio visits to after parties late into the night. The city becomes completely saturated with contemporary art. And speaking of fashion, Frieze has increasingly become a crossover moment between the art world and luxury fashion culture. Vogue even highlighted the fashion presence at the opening days of this year's fair, emphasizing how Frieze has become a social and cultural event far beyond just the art itself. That crossover between art, design, fashion, architecture, and lifestyle feels especially strong this year because Frieze Week overlaps with NYC design and several other cultural events happening across the city. So visitors aren't only seeing gallery booths, they're experiencing New York during one of the busiest creative weeks of the year. And when we talk about partnerships and collaborations, Frieze 2026 is also leaning heavily into institutional relationships. The collaborations with the Whitney and Dia Foundation are major examples, but the fair also continues partnerships with nonprofits and curator-led initiatives. That balance between commercial success and institutional credibility is part of why Frieze remains so influential. Because yes, there's obviously a market side to all of this. Major sales happen here, museum acquisitions happen here, careers can completely change after a successful Frieze presentation. But there's also a curatorial side that shapes conversations happening across the art world for years afterward. And even for people who aren't collectors, Frieze can still be inspiring because it offers this rare opportunity to see an enormous range of contemporary art practices all in one place. Painting, sculpture, video, installation, performance, conceptual work, textile-based practices, digital art, socially engaged work, it's all happening simultaneously. You can spend hours walking through the fair and still feel like you missed something. That's part of the excitement. There's also something fascinating about the psychology of an art fair itself. Galleries spend months preparing these booths. Artists create works specifically for these presentations. Booth layouts are designed almost like temporary exhibitions. Every wall, every lighting decision, every placement matters. And for 5 days, this temporary city of art exists inside the shed. Then suddenly it disappears. The works go back into collections, museums, storage, galleries, or shipping crates traveling across the world to the next destination. There's something very cinematic about that. And for New York specifically, Frieze continues to reinforce the city's role as one of the global capitals of contemporary art. Even in an era where the art world is increasingly international and decentralized, New York still holds enormous influence. During Frieze Week, you really feel that concentration of energy. Curators from major museums, international collectors, emerging artists, critics, journalists, influencers, and art lovers all moving through the same spaces at the same time. It becomes this intersection of culture, commerce, and creativity. So whether you're attending Frieze New York to discover emerging artists, see museum quality works, network within the industry, experience the city during Art Week, or simply observe the atmosphere, the 2026 edition feels like one of the strongest and most internationally connected editions in recent years. Frieze New York 2026 runs from May 13th through May 17th at the Shed in Hudson Yards in New York City.